Hello and welcome. I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're taking a deep dive into 18th century fashion, and we're going to make a round gown from the late 1770s or early 1780s. Before we get into the actual making of the gown, we are going to take a look at first 18th century dressmaking in general, how the making of the garments affected the garments and the fashion, and then we'll talk about the fashion, how it evolved, and how it came to this era's round gown. To start, we kind of have to go back and look at the 17th century and the dressmaking traditions of that era to get into why dresses were made the way they were in the 18th century. In the 17th century, most dresses were made by tailors because they had the constructed bodies or corsets built into the dresses. And because of the structure of garments, they were definitely a male-led garment industry, and they were made by tailors because most of these bone bodies would require a lot of hard work, and that was considered more appropriate for men because it's physically quite taxing to actually get those needles to go through all of those layers of fabric. Tailors were a highly valued and highly skilled guild, and to become a tailor you had to apprentice for many years with another tailor and then take the tailor's exam to be accepted as a guild member before you could qualify for actually taking commissions and work on your own. And because these bodies evolved very much at the same time as male garments, and the male garments' bodies evolved, the structural elements and the techniques are very similar. So that's why tailors would make them, and they were made mostly patterned flat and then fit onto the person's body. And that's how most female garments were made for most of the 17th century. But in the late 17th century, there comes a new fashion called the mantua gown. And this mantua gown is just a loosely draped piece of cloth, basically, that is pinned in place to form the actual gown. And it has much less structure to it. It's much more loose, as in it has flowy skirts, it has drapery, it has a lot of different elements than was traditionally in tailored garments. Still, women did wear bodies or stays or corsets underneath, but those were typically a separate garment. And the mantua gown would be a gown built on top of it, and then it would have the stays underneath, and then you would have a stomacher piece covering the gap. And because this new mantua gown with its drapery required a very different set of skills than was typical of a tailor with its flat patterning, a new job evolved called a mantua maker. And mantua makers were mostly women. From the mantua gown and the mantua makers themselves comes a completely different way of making gowns. And this evolves during the 18th century, first into the English gown. The English gown, also called a nightgown, was basically at first just like a mantua, except that it didn't have the draperies on the skirt bit, but instead would close in the skirts. This was very much influenced by the robe volante, which was another different kind of early 18th century gown that later evolved into the robe a la Francais or sackback gown. The reason why we have two different names for these garments is that basically English and French fashion were slightly different, though they did influence each other, and you do see French fashion in England in the form of sack gowns, and you do later on especially see English back gowns in France. But the terms were different. So a robe a la Francais is the name that they would use in France, and a robe a la Anglaise, or English gown, would be the French term for the English back gown. In England, that would be called a nightgown, and then the robe a la Francais would be called a sack gown. So that's why there's two terms. They can be used interchangeably now, but English people would be using nightgown and sack gown, and no, a nightgown doesn't actually refer to it being worn at night. That's just the name of the garment in English. Whereas in French, you would use the terms robe a la Francais and robe a la Anglaise. The reason why in modern language English gown is much more common than nightgown is simply because the word nightgown means such a vastly different thing than it did in the 18th century. That evolves basically from the mantua, and it can be closed or it can be open in the skirts. And in the 1740s, it also evolves into the round gown, where the skirt is closed, but it is not closed the same way as previously in some of the mantua gowns, but instead it is closed as it has the petticoat built into it. In those previous English gowns, the front would close the same way as on this robe volante, so that basically the front edges just meet. I don't know how much of this is viral bias, but at least according to the examples that we mostly see nowadays, most of these round gowns were expensive brocades, so I'm guessing that the reason why they had the round gown was basically to save fabric. So you wouldn't necessarily do it on cheaper material if you could afford the separate petticoat and the open English back gown. The round gown seems to disappear by 1750s, and this is also when there is no more the mantua gown. It has clearly evolved into the English gown, and that is open in the front. So the way a mantua maker would work is first the client would get their stays made by the tailor. The stays are the corset of the 18th century. They are no longer called bodies like they were in the 17th century. And when she is standing in her stays, then the mantua maker would drape the fabric over her and make basically the dress on her body. Of course, the client could go home and while she's sewing, but this is basically how the gowns were made. And this sort of dressmaking technique leads quite naturally to pleating different sorts of things, so to get the fabric to sit on the body. So these pleats could sometimes be sewn down, as in the English gown, or they could be left loose, as in the robe volante and in the sackback gown. And basically these two gowns, with some variation, are what is fashionable for several decades there, up until the 1770s, when we start to see new gowns evolve. Around this time, several things in fashion happen. First of all, the hair starts rising off the head and becoming really big. And also, the gowns, instead of having a separate stomacher in the front, they start closing all the way. And as that happens, the round gown makes a resurgence. At this point, I want to point out that there are also a lot of other gowns and a lot of other styles that become fashionable at this time, but I'm going to be focusing now on just this part because this is relevant to this video. If you guys are interested, I could make a separate video on how fashion evolves and what the different garments are in the last quarter of the 18th century, so let me know in the comments. Is that something you'd be interested in? And while you're at it, please like this video if you are enjoying it. And though gowns are still often trimmed elaborately, you can definitely see that they are getting much more simple than they used to be in the past. So a round gown makes sense in that point too, because if you're not really looking for a bunch of fancy trim at the skirt fronts where those gown edges are open, then it makes sense that why don't you just make it into a round gown instead. And of course, it also saves on fabric. There is a lot of earlier 18th century gowns that get remade in this era into this newer style, but there's also a lot of gowns that are just made with the old silk, because fabric is very expensive, so people might have some laying about, and then because of the simpler fashion, even if they don't have enough for a full robe a la Francais, they can make the simpler round gown out of it. And that's precisely why I made a round gown out of this fabric. This fabric was a gift that my husband got for me for our silk wedding anniversary. I was kind of persistent that I must get silk for the silk wedding anniversary. So when we were in London, we went to Gold Hawk Road and I could choose anything I wanted. And I chose this silk brocade, and it is so gorgeous, but it was extremely expensive. So I just simply couldn't get enough for a robe a la Francais. I got 3.5 yards, and that was plenty enough for this. My two main inspirations for this are also round gowns that use silk that is clearly earlier from the mid-century. And because the sewing machine hadn't been invented, of course all of these gowns were hand-stitched. So since these garments evolved with them being hand-stitched, the way these are made it often doesn't actually make it much faster to use a machine. So that's one of the reasons why I'm going to be completely hand sewing this, because actually the only part where I could actually save time really by machine stitching it would be the long skirt seams. With everything else, it's so quick and efficient to just hand sew it that it doesn't actually make that much sense to try to use a machine for them. Back in the 18th century, a mantua maker could make an English gown or a round gown in 12 hours. I'm not sure if I made this in 12 hours, probably not, but I made it on and off again in less than a week. And though these sewists were extremely skilled, they wouldn't waste time sewing anything unnecessarily small stitches or being too careful in places where you didn't need to be careful. And also because fabric was extremely expensive, garments were often altered to fit either your changing body or somebody else's body later on. Secondhand fashion was extremely common in the 18th century. There was huge markets for secondhand gowns. So these different reasons led to garments being made quick and efficiently in a way that it was as easy as possible to take them apart when needed to, but they would stay together. So you would use strong and minutely precise stitches only where necessary. So a part where the stitches show onto the outside, you wouldn't use fine stitching. But then on an inside part, especially one that does not carry a lot of weight, you would use big sloppy stitches. And that was the way they did it then. They wouldn't necessarily see it as a bad thing, like maybe we would consider it nowadays. They definitely saw it as a practical thing. So if you see me doing neat stitches in some places and big sloppy stitches in other places, that's simply because that's the way the garments are made. You don't want to waste your time on a thing that doesn't need really precise stitching. Here is my version of the Isabella McTavish Fraser gown, and I'm using this as an example to show you how 18th century gowns are made. The way these are made is that this lining is draped on the body and made to fit the body. And then the rest of the gown is constructed over the lining. So basically, if you have a fitted lining that fits you, you can basically make any sort of fitted back 18th century gown using this same lining. On the other hand, a sack back gown's lining is slightly different from this. So basically, you can take any 18th century gown pattern and get the lining to fit your body, and then you can construct any sort of 18th century gown over that lining. Since I made this gown, I've actually gained a little weight, and this is also wool, so it stretches a little bit on the body, and so since I'm using now silk, I'm going to be making a new master pattern that fits my body better, and that is going to be then my master pattern for any other future 18th century gowns I want to make. Here is my new and improved English gown or fitted back 18th century gown pattern. And this back piece is based on my Italian gown that I made in 2020 when I was quite a bit smaller than I am now. So I enlarged it a little bit and then changed the shape a little bit because I want this to be a fitted back, not an Italian back gown. And this one is my Isabella McTavish Fraser gown's front, and I changed it a bit to fit this slightly earlier style better, and also to give myself more bust shape because I'll be using silk instead of wool, so it won't have as much give in it. How I came up with this improved pattern is basically just winging it. I took the pattern pieces and just drew it based on my assumptions. So we will fit this lining on our body and then make any changes that need to be, and that will be my new master pattern for 18th century fitted back gowns. And here's the first try of the lining. I'm not too concerned with the back because that looseness is just, I can take seam allowances in a little bit, but the front is too big at the waist, so here I'm pitting it onto my body to change that line. And with it pinned into place, I feel like the fit is pretty good. There is some puckering at the underarm, but that's mainly because the seam allowance is still up there. I'll redraft and cut that front piece, and then I think we're ready to go. I measure my back length in my stays and bump pad, and then cut that out of the fashion fabric. Then I place the back lining piece on the folded fashion fabric, so that the upper edge of the lining piece meets the fold line, and at the bottom there's a 2-inch gap. Then I draw that line. Then I backstitch along this line. Okay, here's my natural waistline marked, and here's the end of the lining, and then this is the 2 inches that it goes further back. So we'll cut this line from here diagonally to that. And then press that seam flat. Then I pin my lining to the fashion fabric so that the center back seams match. And from the fashion fabric side, backstitch into that seam. Then I pleat down that fashion fabric onto the lining to form those back pleats that make an English gown an English gown. The back construction stays the same throughout the 18th century, but the thing that changes is the width of those back pleats. Earlier in the century they are wider, and later they get narrower and narrower, until the 1780s when they can start facing inwards instead of outwards, and eventually become seamed back pieces of an Italian gown. Then I trim off the excess from the bodice sides, leaving the fabric full width from the waist down. This will form the back half of the skirts. And then the back pleats get sewn down with a prick stitch. This is basically a back stitch, but just with a very small stitch taken in the front and with a longer stitch taken in the back side. Next I cut the bodice front pieces to match the lining pieces, using those leftover pieces from the bodice back that I just cut off. Then I pin the fashion fabric front pieces to the lining pieces to make sure everything stays flat and smooth while I stitch. Then I fold the seam allowances towards each other and pin it in place, making any necessary cuts to get that neckline to lay smoothly. I do the same to the bottom front edge and make sure that the pieces line up properly. And then I hem stitch along the flat edge of the bottom, and along the center front edges, and along the neckline up until the point where the shoulder straps attach. And then I draw out the pattern piece for the shoulder straps and cut them out of the lining fabric first to test my pattern out. I'm using the mock-ups of my front pieces to eliminate fabric waste. And then I baste the shoulder strap linings onto the back of the bodice so that I can check the fit. If you're fitting on yourself, I find it easier to baste the back on and fit the front on yourself by pinning. And if you're fitting it onto somebody else, I find it easier to baste the front on and then lay it smoothly and then pin the back on to the person. But before we can fit the shoulder straps on, we need to make that scary cut. We cut along the back bodice lining edge in a straight angled line towards the center back, not quite reaching the center back, so that we can pleat the back of the skirts onto the bodice. Be careful to keep the angle right so that you don't end up making your gown short-waisted, and make sure not to cut too deep so that those back pleats don't rip that you already made. To ensure this, I cut a little ways away from the waist and then check the pleating as I go and then cut the necessary bit that is still remaining. Next, I pin the bodice front and back lining pieces together, right sides facing each other, and sew them together with a running back stitch. And backstitch the shoulder strap lining to the bodice back. And after making sure that it fits properly, running backstitch the front of the gown to the shoulder strap lining. Next, making sure that the fabric stays smooth, pin the front bodice fashion fabric over the bodice back, making sure that you follow that curved line of the lining fabrics. Okay, otherwise it looks pretty good, but the neckline, as you can see, is way too high. I have marked with pins where I need to like cut it down to, and then fold it again and re-sew that. The shoulder straps are looking good, and I'm holding the skirts because I don't want to put too much weight on them because they have that cut already made, so the fabric is kind of fragile there, so I don't want to tear it, so I'm holding it. But other than that, it looks really good. Then prick stitch the side seams. Now it's time to pleat the skirts. Shove that edge of the fabric where the back pleat happens in between the lining and the fashion fabric. It doesn't need to be nicely done, just so that it looks nicely from the outside. The skirts get pleated all the way up until the side of your bodice. You need to measure this on your body to make sure that it's in the correct place. And as you pin these in place, make sure that the fashion fabric's seam allowance is turned to the inside and that the lining fabric is left loose, both now and when you sew on the skirts. And then we rehem that fixed bodice neckline. And then I backstitch the skirts to the bodice. Because this part is under a lot of stress, I use a thicker silk thread for this part. And also because my silk brocade is rather thick and there's many layers of fabric, I do it like this instead of the regular way working from only one side of the fabric, because simply otherwise the stitches would be much larger than I intended them to be. Now on the free front portion of the bodice, seam allowances are folded towards each other and pinned in place. And once you reach the portion with the skirts, just the lining fabric's seam allowance is folded to the inside and pinned in place. That very back tip there might be a little fiddly, and if you need to cut some of it away, then you can do it now. And now all of that gets hem stitched in place with the visible bodice front bits with small neat stitches, and the part where the skirts are with bigger sloppier stitches, making sure to only take a small portion of the skirt into the stitch. But because we're making a round gown, not an open English gown, we still need a skirt front panel. Measure the correct length on your body with your stays and bum pad in place, both at the front and at the sides. And if there is a difference, make that adjustment at the top of the skirt, not the bottom. For me, that meant cutting an angle that dips at the center front 2 inches from the sides. And then the hem is cut straight. And then this newly cut skirt front piece gets attached to the back piece. I start by pinning them together, remembering to leave a 10-inch pocket slit at the top, and stitch them together with a running back stitch. I make a narrow hem for the bottom by folding up the fabric twice. Unlike in the Victorian era, this era's hems don't really have a lot of structure to them, so you don't need a large turnaround or any sort of hem linings or anything like that. Unless, of course, you're making a trained gown, in which case you might want a hem protector. The fashion of the late 70s and early 80s wasn't actually for trained gowns, but rather they would often be short enough to show the ankles. This front skirt portion gets pleated onto a linen tape waistband. So you mark onto the waistband tape the center of the waistband and also the sides where the skirt ends. You make a big box pleat onto the middle and then pleat the sides to match the length of the skirt waistband. You can just eyeball these. These do not have to be even. There's several extant garments that do not even have the matching amount of pleats on both sides of the skirt. And then I baste the pleats in place to make sewing them later easier. Then I sew them to the edge of the waistband. And then fold the waistband over to the inside of the skirt and hem stitch it down, leaving all the raw edges onto the inside. And then I prick stitch the seam allowances on the pocket slit edges down for a clean finish. And then I draft my sleeves based off of the Patterns of Fashion 1 and 6. Here's the sleeve. I took it in a little bit here at underarm, but other than that, it looks pretty good. It's a little long, but because there's going to be that fold line here, I don't think I want to take anything off because this has the seam allowance, so it will shorten already because of that. So I think we're good to go. Remember to make any necessary adjustments to your master pattern and then cut the fashion fabric. And of course the lining if your mock-up doesn't work as the lining. Now put your sleeve lining and fashion fabric together with the wrong sides facing each other, and then flip the lining front edge to match with those lining back edges and pin through all 3 layers. And next you'll sew in a running back stitch through all 3 layers. Fold that fashion fabric over that seam that you just sewed, so that now all the raw edges are encased in the sleeve, and pin in place. And then sew closed with a prick stitch. The bottom edges seam allowances get folded in towards each other and stitched in place. Then I baste the underside of the sleeve onto the sleeve edge, but only the underside, not the portion that is on the shoulder strap, and you'll see soon why. Okay, and now the bottom edge is basted on, and now how we do the top is it gets sewn on top of the shoulder strap. I'm first going to baste it on, but basically it just gets placed here on this strap, and then you pin it and then baste it. And then there is a bit of excess in the back, and that is going to get pleated down. And the reason for this excess in the back is simply so that you have the full range of motion, so that you can put your hand up. That disappears once you put your hand up. The way I like to fit these sleeves when I'm fitting on myself is I use my knee as kind of my replacement shoulder, and then just make it smooth on that, and then that will make it smooth on my shoulder as well. And last test to make sure that we have the full range of motion. And now the under portion of that sleeve gets stitched down with a back stitch. And for the upper portion, the one that is on the shoulder strap, that gets sewn with a running back stitch on the outer side of the garment. And next, before we can sew the fashion fabric shoulder straps on, we need to make a neck back piece. This will cover the raw edges of the top neckline. And then that gets prick stitched in place. And now it's finally time to place that shoulder strap fashion fabric. Again, I use my knee to mimic my shoulder so that the fashion fabric doesn't pull weirdly on the shoulder line. I fold all the raw edges onto the inside and make sure that those previous stitching lines get covered by the fashion fabric. And then I prick stitch it in place. Okay, now one last try with everything sewn on, and I'll need to make a slight correction here. The strap placement was a little wrong, so that it started gaping there at the neckline. So just a tiny tuck in, and I'll sew that down like that, and then it works. And now as for the sleeve, because the sleeve is a little long here, it's supposed to have a little tuck at here at the elbow crease, so that first of all it will make bending your elbow easier, but also slightly shorten the sleeve. And so that will keep the elbow like slightly bent, make it easier to bend the elbow. And then I decided to also tuck in this sleeve, because first of all the lining was showing a lot, and second of all it's slightly long still. So if I tuck it in like this, that will create much nicer sleeve. And here is the final look. Those sleeve flounces and the neck tucker are separate pieces of lace that are sewn onto a linen tape and then basted onto the gown. That way they can be taken off for cleaning or added to another gown, or maybe changed for another pair. And because body modesty as we know it nowadays didn't exist yet, that lace tucker was considered enough to fill that low neckline.